You're listening to The White Rabbit, conversations on the art of presenting in a rather noisy world. Your hosts are Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. Matt helps leaders of international companies speak, write, and present with confidence. Alper is a communications trainer and a startup investor with a diverse portfolio of companies in Barcelona. If you like this podcast, please share it with friends and colleagues. Now, on to Matt and Alper for today's conversation.
Alper, recently we had Brad Ferris on the podcast, and somehow the conversation got around to presenting bad news to the board. And you and I thought, wow, this sounds like a good topic for future episodes, how to present bad news to the board.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went off in our separate directions, and we wrote down some notes about what we wanted to talk about, what we would advise people about. And when before the podcast, you and I were comparing notes, and I realized that I kind of just randomly sprayed down some ideas onto a piece of paper, and you actually came prepared to the podcast with a much more thorough and much better thought out 4-step process.
I thought that was the expectation in the preparation process.
Okay, so let's start out. Let's lead with your 4-step process. So this is 4 steps for presenting bad news to the board. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, not only to the board, but it's a 4-step process for presenting bad news, let's say, in any kind of setting.
Okay.
Because this is material that I already shared in the trainings, so maybe I may have cheated there. Like this is not from scratch.
Okay.
But again, it's not just about presenting to the board, but presenting in general, where you have to talk about some bad news and what to do about them.
Okay. So presenting bad news in general, not necessarily just to the
let's
board.
Say
negative news.
Yeah, negative results. Quarter is ending, you're way behind, and
sure,
you're cringing in your seat before the time comes to you to get up and present there. So what to do in those situations?
Good idea. And so you've got 4 steps for handling this process. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's start with the first one. What's first on your mind?
Well, the first step is acknowledge the bad news or the negative results up front.
Okay.
So when you start speaking, when you're presenting, don't delay. There is no point in delaying what's to come.
Okay.
And you and I talked about before recording, and you have some very good opinions on this as well. I'm a huge fan of, okay, this happened and we're not ignoring it.
Yeah.
So if even if it is just an elephant in the room, just point to the elephant and make people become aware of the situation in its all details, and in a way that is comprehensible by everyone, that something unwanted has happened.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that.
Okay. One thing that I've found in my work with people on this subject is that when they are going through this process of getting ready to present bad information or negative information, often they take it very personally, and that kind of gets in the way of what you are talking about, because they're thinking, this project is behind schedule, or it's over budget, or whatever the bad news is, or the sales are down, or whatever the bad news is. And they're kind of taking it personally. They're thinking, I'm a bad human being, or I'm an inadequate employee, or something like that. And that gets in the way of them, that taking it personally gets in the way of them addressing the subject directly, or addressing the subject head on. Do you see the same thing happening sometimes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. Another thing that I find when dealing with this subject is that it seems like often the clients feel the need to sugarcoat the bad news, or to whitewash it, or to make it look better than it really is. And this not only hides the problem, but here's a fancy word for you: obfuscates the problem.
Okay, I'll need a dictionary.
Yeah, it's like Matt the dictionary here. Okay, but it not only hides the problem or clouds the problem, but it also kind of insults the audience, because, like, for example, if you're presenting negative news to the board, for example, or to your team, or whoever you're presenting this negative news to, they hear bad news all the time. I mean, their job is to solve problems. That's why they're there. That's why the company hired them. And the people that you're talking to, they don't need to be insulted. They're already big boys and big girls. They don't need you to sugarcoat or whitewash or try to cover over the problem. So you're not doing anyone any favors
I
by
totally agree with that.
yeah, you're not doing anyone any favors by trying to make it sound better than it really is. Do you find that too in your trainings, that
Yeah.
sometimes people are
And I
trying to
believe,
put a nice spin on
yes.
things?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think it's just shooting yourself in the foot because, I mean, these people are going to smell, well, let's not turn the podcast into explicit, but they're going to smell something fall like miles away.
Uh-huh.
So there is no point in me going out there and trying to pretend that it's not as bad as it looks. It's not as bad as it looks or anything. Let's just lay what's out there up front.
Yeah.
And then have the guts to talk about it and deal with it. So I completely agree with you where there is absolutely no point in trying to sugarcoat it.
And shall we? You have 4 points. Shall we? That was kind of number one. Shall we move on to
Yeah.
what,
Yeah, that
what is
was the
number
first
two?
step.
What is number two? This is step number two.
Well, the second step is, of course, state why you believe this happened this way.
Ah.
And I like to underline the word why you believe, because I see in my experience that, especially in negative results or bad news, the reasons why they happened actually may be quite different than the reasons why you believe they happened. And the last thing I would want as a presenter in front of some critical decision makers is to learn to find out that why I believed was the reason is completely different than the actual reason.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah,
it's
good point.
just some wording.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I'm just talking about some minor wording here. But instead of stating 100% this is why it happened, I would just give myself the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
And say, after stating what the problem is, of course, as a step one, in the step two, I will say, and this is why I believe this happened. This is why we estimate the reason. This is what we estimate the reason behind the negative results is.
Yeah.
And to state your position on why you think this happened.
You mentioned the wording, that the wording is important, that I believe that blah, blah, blah. And one thing that Brad mentioned recently was the importance of a two-way conversation. And this sounds like a great opportunity for a two-way conversation, because that phrase that you recommend using, I believe that blah, 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 I believe, using that phrase invites other people to chime in with opinions that may be better than yours. They first of all, they may not be the same, but they might actually be better than yours.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, imagine yourself stating the negative news, talking about the problem, and then saying that, and this is why it happened.
Okay.
And then you want to keep with the presentation, and one of the board member raises his or her hand and says, well, that's not actually why it happened. This is actually why it happened.
Okay.
And then imagine the discomfort that you would feel in front of all these people at that situation.
Yeah.
Crafting your sentence and starting it by saying, I believe, actually gives you a bit of an escape, let's say, in the event that something like that happens. And you can always say, okay, so obviously we were mistaken. But it's different, I believe. I mean, I really believe it's different to say we were mistaken after you state a fact 100%, versus after you state a belief about the reasons behind it.
Sure. And one thing that comes to mind when you mention this phrase, I believe that blah, blah, blah. One thing that comes to mind is that whether it's your team looking to you for leadership or the board, whoever you're presenting to, it's highly likely that in the end, they want you to pick one. It's not like they're sitting there hoping that you're going to be wishy-washy and say, I believe this, I believe that. And by the way, the problem is yours, and solve it for me and give me the solution. That's not what anybody is looking for. So you're inviting a two-way conversation. You're inviting this, to borrow a phrase from the first George Bush, you're inviting the 1,000 points of light or something like that. You're inviting everybody to give their opinion on it. But in the end, whether it's the board or whether it's the CEO or whether it's your team or your department or whatever, they're looking for leadership, and they want to know that this person is going to be able to make a decision. So after you have used this phrase, I believe, and after you have invited this two-way conversation, still your job is not over. You need to pick one and say,
it's not.
Yeah, that sounds like, okay, point number 3 sounds like it was probably the cause. Let's go with that one.
Yeah.
So if we've got points 1 and 2, or steps 1 and 2, if we've addressed those. So tell me about step number 3.
Well, the third step is informing them about the steps that you're going to take
Okay.
to resolve the issue, to improve the results, or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Because believe me, in many cases during these presentations, people just state the obvious, state the problem,
Okay.
and then state the reasons behind it,
Uh-huh.
and then that's it.
Okay.
And of course, it can continue as a two-way conversation, but what are you bringing onto the table?
Yeah.
I mean, if this is the problem, and if you're the one presenting it, if you're the one talking about it, okay, tell me what you're going to do with it.
Okay.
So what are the third step is about presenting to them or telling them the specific steps that you're going to take
Uh-huh.
in the future.
Okay.
It could be, by the way, as short as in 2 hours or as long as in 2 years.
Uh-huh.
But the steps that you're going to take to either prevent this from happening again, or to elevate the results or something like that.
Okay.
So that would be the third step.
And I have a question for you on this third step. So
Sure.
some of the issues that people will be dealing with, they're unpredictable human issues. If your problem is, let's say it's one person on the team, or it's a section of the team or whatever, you might resolve that problem with one conversation that takes one day. Or it might be that solving that problem takes 10 conversations over the period of a month. And it's almost impossible to predict with a certain timeline which one it's going to be when you're standing there in front of your audience making your presentation. It's almost impossible to make a definite prediction. So what are some of the ways that you could deal with that impossibility?
Well, I think the fourth step deals with that, or helps to achieve that.
Okay.
At least, because the fourth step is after you talk to them about the specific steps you will be taking, the fourth step I recommend is give them a timeline about what you're hoping to achieve and when.
Okay.
So what was the step number 1? What are the bad results? Okay, we talk about them. The step number 2 was, this is why I believe it happened. Step number 3 was, these are the steps that we're going to take. Okay. Don't finish with that. Don't end it there.
Okay.
Take it one step further and tell them, with these steps that we're planning to take, we are aiming to achieve this and this and this by this time or this date or whatever.
Okay.
Or we are aiming to get to this point within this time frame. So give them something solid to work with. Of course, none of these can be 100% guaranteed. I mean, no one knows what's going to happen in the future, but at least talk about a timeline of taking actions that will, like I said, fix the situation or improve the situation, and give them a specific time frame about what you are hoping to achieve or aiming to achieve and when.
Okay. And so I have a kind of a similar question for you on this fourth step. So in this fourth step, let's say that I am the hypothetical person giving this bad news presentation. If I'm that hypothetical person, should I feel pressure to make the timeline more definite than I feel comfortable with? Like, for example, I have that conversation, and it might be one problematic person, and it might take one day to have one conversation with this person, or it might take a month to knock this person into line. So there's a time range in there. And I know that, okay, my project, my timeline, my estimate might be a little longer if it takes me on the long side of a month to solve this problem with this person. Should I feel pressure to be more definite in my timeline estimate than I feel comfortable with?
Just to make sure that I understand you correctly, when you say being definite, are you talking about being accurate?
Yeah, I'm talking about being accurate. And is it okay to have a range in this timeline?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend it, because I have heard about these situations. For example, after delivering bad news, some promises are made, some time frames are given, some timelines are given, but they were not realistic. And lo and behold, when the time came, they had to have another uncomfortable conversation with the same people in front of which they had given some promises beforehand. So no, I mean, look, you're already standing in front of people. It's already uncomfortable. why make things worse by promising something that you believe you may not be able to deliver?
True.
So if it takes 1 month, if you believe it takes 1 month,
Uh-huh.
say that.
Okay.
Again, I think in this case it would be wise to use the phrase again, I believe,
Uh-huh.
because like there are no guarantees. You remember that movie phrase, there is nothing certain besides death and taxes.
Yeah, of course.
So unless you're delivering death or imposing taxes on people,
Uh-huh.
I think it would be safe to assume that your promise is not 100% guaranteed,
Okay.
and don't take any additional risks. Don't say 1 week, whereas you think it would take 1 month.
Okay.
I know it sounds like almost unnecessary
Uh-huh.
to put an emphasis on this,
Uh-huh.
but I'm telling you, I have been in those situations where I heard people deliver unrealistic promises,
Uh-huh.
and then when I met with them at a later time, they massively regretted it. So there is no point in doing that.
So, but before we wrap up for the day, I do want to mention one other point, which we haven't discussed yet, and Brad kind of brought this up on that recent episode, and that was that start the discussion earlier than the presentation, and this would apply especially if you are presenting to somebody outside of your group, because if you're giving a project update to your project team, they already know that there's a problem. But if you're updating somebody outside of the team or outside of the project, maybe they don't know there's a problem yet. Like if you're updating the board or the CEO or whatever, maybe they don't know there's a problem yet. So start the discussion earlier than the presentation. And the reason for that is just so that you don't blindside them. You don't want in the meeting during the presentation, you don't want to be giving people an unpleasant surprise. If there's a problem that needs to be discussed, you want them to know that there's a problem that needs to be discussed. You want them to know that there's a problem before the meeting starts, before you even get up there to speak. You want them to kind of know that, okay, there's a problem and we need to come ready to discuss it. So Alper, before we wrap up for the day, so can you recap for me what the 4 points are?
Sure. The first one is state the obvious.
Okay.
State the negative results or the weak outcomes or whatever at the beginning of the presentation. Don't delay it. Just state the fact from the beginning.
Sure.
The second step is tell them why you believe it happened this way instead of why. I mean, not instead of, but remember we had talked about the difference between why you believe it happened and the real reason. They can be different. So it's important to state that.
Yeah.
The third step is tell them what the next steps are that you're going to take. I mean, show them that you're prepared to tackle the issue. And the fourth step is give them a timeline on what you are aiming to achieve and when you're aiming to achieve that.
Okay. So those are the 4 steps that we discussed today. And then for a future episode, there's something that I would like to dig into a little bit more.
Yeah.
Should I mention what that is?
I'm sure we can dig much deeper. Yeah. But
yeah,
go ahead.
The subject that I would like to dig into in a future episode is based on another comment that Brad made, and he mentioned he was talking about self-leadership, and we asked him, "What do you mean by self-leadership?" And he said that my emotions are under control. That's what self-leadership means. It means keeping your emotions under control. And a lot of people would hear that and think that phrase, keeping your emotions under control, a lot of people would hear that and think that phrase means that you have to be a cold robot when you're presenting. But then immediately after that, he mentioned, if you're not nervous, I don't want you up there. These were the words of his high school debate.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, if you're not nervous, I don't want you up there. So on the one hand, you've got this one phrase that makes people think that, okay, in order to execute this phrase, I have to be a cold robot. And it's immediately followed by another phrase that says, if you're not nervous, I don't want you up there. And so that's what I want to dig into is, why is it cool to be a little bit nervous? Why do you want that when you are presenting?
Let's definitely do that.
Okay. So we'll dig into that for a future episode. So we're about out of time. So shall we wrap it up here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll talk to you. I'll talk to you future. I'll talk to you in the future in the next episode.
Yeah. So I'll talk to you in the next episode. Thanks a lot, Alper.
All right. Thank you for listening to The White Rabbit with Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. You can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or through your favorite feed.